In all honesty, I was not thrilled about doing Warren Remembers. It was a deal made, I think, between Fred Pierce and Barry Diller, and I was not looking forward to it. And I was not looking forward to it because I thought it was going to be very, very difficult for it to succeed and be as successful as The Winds of War was. And at the same time, I thought doing it creatively well was going to be very, very, very difficult. And so I went into it somewhat reluctantly, although um, when I finally rolled up the sleeves and all of that, I really did get into it. One of the things that happened in Winds of War and Remembrance was, to Dan's everlasting credit, this was an extraordinary film in many ways, such as this film was the first film shot in Auschwitz ever done. It was 2 years of negotiation to get in. So that whole sequence in Auschwitz, which was an incredible sequence, was for the first time American audience had ever seen it. And the kind of detail that went into the making of War and Remembrance was phenomenal. We had pieces of prisoners' cotton uniforms from Auschwitz that we'd taken and then reworked the cotton to get exactly the same fibers to build for our costumes. It's hard to believe what 46,000 people worked on War and Remembrance. 46,000 people. It was a huge, huge undertaking. It was $135 million undertaking. I never thought it would do as well as the first one. I thought it would do okay. It was a great storytelling. Dan did a brilliant job on it. The bloom was coming off the miniseries Rose, but there were other problems as well. One of them was the 1988 strike. And we had to schedule, we had nothing on the air, so we had to bring War and Remembrance, part of it into November, when we played it in November, and part of it, the other part of it went to May. So we had a huge gap between those two exposures. And therefore, people lost interest. What a surprise. The other problem with it, I think, was it was a sequel, and therefore not as interesting. We lost some of the cast that we had in the original that were not in the next one. The other problem was how we scheduled it. We scheduled a lot of 3 hours, and television had changed in that time. Television had changed immensely. It was no longer 3 or 4 networks who controlled 80-90% of the viewing. Now the networks were controlling maybe 60% of the viewing, and there were so many other cable stations. So if you ran a 3-hour, in the early days when you had control, there's really no other place for the audience to go. Now there are many, many places for them to go. So we lost that tool, that way of scheduling, and we scheduled a bunch of 3 hours, which I never wanted to do, but we had to, and that hurt us badly on War and Remembrance.
By the way, you said 135 million. I don't think that figure was ever reported at more than 105, was it?
That would be correct. You're hearing it now, live. I think it ended up it being 135.
Yeah, because I remember there was a lot of concern about the budget at the time.
There certainly was a lot of concern about the budget at the time, because halfway through the production, or not the production, just before production itself, but well after $20 million of pre-production, Capital Cities came in and took over ABC, and they had a lot of concerns about it, as I did. But we were in $20 million at this point, and to just scrap the $20 million seemed a little foolhardy. If there was another reason, if Cap Cities had pulled the plug on War and Remembrance, which they had the capability of doing, was now their network, it would have sent a message to that town that would have been so horrendous, so terrible, about cheap guys, station guys coming in who don't believe in quality programming, and the first thing they do is swallow $20 million in order to get out of a large commitment. It would have been a disastrous signal, I think, to the creative community, and they were aware of that. They just had to muffle their way through. The problem for them also was that these guys were extraordinarily talented, wonderful guys. I really, really liked the Cap Cities guys. I'm very able. But they were station guys, and they weren't used to this kind of deal. So, for example, and 2 months before, or a month and a half before we went on air, they were talking about how much it cost and it was too much money and they shouldn't have spent that much money. Well, in the entertainment business, you never do that. You never do that. It is great and great and great and great and great and wonderful and perfect and terrific right up to the moment that it isn't. And then the next one's great and great and great. But they didn't have that mentality. They hadn't had that training. So some of the things that they said about War and Remembrance actually hurt some of the performance of it, I think. But War and Remembrance was very, very well done. I don't think it was scheduled well, and I think that scheduling hurt it. And it went on in time of huge change in terms of viewing habits.